Good morning. Welcome to our young adult Sunday school lesson, our fusion class for August the 16th, 2020. This is on page 80 in your student book if you want to look along. The unit theme is Courage to Stand Alone. We've been looking at that throughout this unit. Most of our lessons for the month of August have been coming out of the book of Daniel. We'll be in Daniel chapter 5 today, verses 1 through 31. If you want to get out your Bible and follow along, that would be great. Today's lesson is the writing on the wall. We see this phrase used in our society a lot to kind of say when somebody has kind of an in-your-face moment. He saw the handwriting on the wall. He saw the future. He saw what was going to happen inevitably. We see that phrase used quite often. Well, it comes from Daniel chapter 5 is where that phrase comes from. He saw the writing on the wall. So we're going to talk about that. Our family theme for today is God rules the kingdom of men. Now, there are governments throughout our world. There's the Chinese government, the Russian government, there's the Middle Eastern governments in and around Israel, Iraq, Iran, India, Great Britain, Europe, South America, African nations. There's all different kinds of kingdoms of men. But God rules over all of them. And that's what this lesson is kind of helping us to understand. Daniel, as he was writing chapter 5, he was letting these earthly kings know that ultimately God is in control. No matter how powerful an earthly government thinks it is, no matter how knowledgeable an earthly government thinks it is, God is more knowledgeable. God is more powerful. He can establish earthly kingdoms and he can destroy them. I think the United States is going through a major cultural upheaval right now. And a push against Christianity, a push against God and against Jesus Christ and his teachings. We're seeing that all around us and the chaos that goes along with that. But we're going to see it in Daniel chapter 5 today, and we're going to see how God deals with kingdoms of men and how he can put them in their place. Daniel was one of the major prophets. He preached during the Babylonian captivity. He was carried a prisoner to Babylon around the age of 12, and he began to serve in the court of Nebuchadnezzar by the age of 15. He had three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were their Hebrew names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were their Babylonian names, and they became leaders in Babylon as a result of God's intervention in a couple of situations, as we've already covered. Today's study involves Nebuchadnezzar's son, or possibly even his grandson. His name was Belshazzar. And this is some years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is no longer in the picture. We have a king after Nebuchadnezzar, and we think possibly it was even Nebuchadnezzar's grandson rather than his son. But as you read the chapter, you will pick up on how it refers to Nebuchadnezzar as the father, which would lead us to believe that this Belshazzar was his son, but archaeologically and looking at it from the perspective that we have today after these events, it may have actually been his grandson. But at any rate, the main thing that we're dealing with is pride in this particular lesson. We as individuals tend to develop pride. Now, pride is a tricky thing. Proverbs 16 and 18 says, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Pride is a slippery slope. It's good to feel good about yourself. It's good to have self-esteem. But to become prideful takes it a step further and then takes on the impression that I'm better than everybody else and nobody is more powerful than me, and I don't need anybody to help me. So pride can become a negative thing. I see this in physical therapy when a man that's older in age refuses to use a walking stick because of pride. He's prideful. He wants to be able to walk on his own, and using a cane makes him appear to be less of a man. And so some men, because of pride, really struggle with using an assistive device, a cane, a walker, or something along those lines when their balance is bad, and usually won't resort to using one of those until after they've had a fall or a major accident. So pride, in that sense, is not good. It sets a person up for failure. So pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. When I feel like I'm better than everybody else, I set myself up for failure. And that's what God says in Proverbs. So this lesson, this entire lesson that we're going to look at today, kind of mirrors what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, in that Nebuchadnezzar was driven from men. And if you look back to chapter 4, you will see a situation where Nebuchadnezzar also kind of went through a similar circumstance in a similar situation. So pride is dangerous. Being haughty, thinking you're better than everybody else, is a dangerous situation to be in. And we just need to know that and be very, very careful. Now, the first section of this, God can use any means necessary to humble those who disregard him. So God is able to get our attention in a number of different ways, and we're going to see how he got the attention of Belshazzar in the lesson today. So in Daniel chapter 5 verse 1, it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. So he had a huge party. 1,000 guests. I want you to think about that. This is a lot of people that Belshazzar has gathered to the palace for this huge party that he's having. So there's a large group of people that has gathered, and it says his lords. So these are governors and important people from the different provinces throughout Babylon that have gathered together. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines, might drink therein. So Belshazzar had the things that were used in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, if you remember, going back several years, Nebuchadnezzar was allowed to destroy Jerusalem, totally destroy the temple, and all the things in the temple that were used for the worship of God. All the vessels that were there were made out of gold and silver and bronze, and were very elaborate and very expensive items. Those things were carried to Babylon, and they were put in the treasury of the king. So Belshazzar grew up knowing about these treasures, and maybe he had seen these treasures. Maybe he had actually slipped in from time to time as a boy and played with these vessels. I want you to think about that. He grew up knowing about these vessels. But now Nebuchadnezzar had a respect for God. He took all those things, but he kind of like put them in storage in the treasury. If you will, he kind of put them in the back of the museum and stuck them in a box and kind of put them out of sight. He never took them to use for himself. He never had them melted down. He just kind of kept them for whatever reason. And so, if you remember through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fiery furnace that we studied about last week, Nebuchadnezzar had a knowledge of God. Daniel interpreting his dreams. Nebuchadnezzar had a knowledge of God. So maybe he had some kind of respect for these items. Well, Belshazzar's having a party. He's tasted some wine. Maybe he's gotten a little loose. And now he's the king. He can make decisions. And he's thinking back to his childhood. Hey, maybe I could run back to the treasury and bring out these vessels that my father never would let me play with, or my grandfather. And maybe I'll just drink wine out of it and show off in front of all of these thousands of people that have gathered in my house. Me and my chosen few, we're going to drink out of these cups and eat off these plates that were used in the temple in Jerusalem, because they're made out of gold and they're very delicate and they are crafted very well. So we'll just use those and we'll drink out of them. So he kind of puts himself in a position to show off the things that his father gathered out of Jerusalem. And he brings them in, and he is going to use these vessels. Now look at verse 3. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. So they poured the wine in these bowls and these cups that were used in the service of God. They're making merry with them. They're drinking wine out of them. And then he goes so far in verse 4, he says, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So in the midst of their partying and drinking wine and celebrating, they were worshiping fake gods. Gods made of gold, of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and stone. These man-made gods, and they were not worshiping the God of heaven. They were using the instruments out of his house, and they were worshiping false gods. Well, folks, one thing God hates, the Bible says clearly, God is a jealous God, and he won't tolerate us worshiping other gods. It's either worship him or be destroyed. If you go over to the Laodicean church, he said, I'd rather you be hot or cold. If you're lukewarm, I'll spew you out of my mouth. So God will not tolerate us worshiping any other gods but him and serving him. So they were drinking out of these vessels, using the vessels, and desecrating them, if you will. They were desecrating these bowls and cups and things that were used in the worship of God. They were drinking wine out of them and actually using them to worship these pagan gods or false gods. And so verse 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. So the king kind of got faint, and his knees were knocking. It scared him absolutely to death. Here they are in the king's palace having a party, 1,000 guests. They've brought out these golden vessels. They've drank wine out of them and worshiped their false gods. And then all of a sudden, a hand appears over against the wall. And it begins to write on the wall. And I just envision dipping my finger in ink and then writing on the wall. I don't know that God needs ink to write with. I don't know if the words were actually carved into the plaster like a knife would carve it, or if it was an ink that marked a paint, if you will, on the wall. I don't know if they glowed or if they were subtle. It doesn't really matter. It's just that this hand appeared and began to write on the wall, and it scared Belshazzar absolutely to death. So then we see, so God has used the hand that appeared out of nowhere, apart from a body, and that hand began to write on the wall in Belshazzar's presence. And that brings us to the second section of this lesson. It says, God uses his people to share his truth with the lost world. God uses his people. So here, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So it's important to know that the writing on the wall was in a language that Belshazzar could not read. So he could not read the letters. He did not know what they meant. He did not know what he was looking at. It obviously was not written in Chaldean. It must have been in a foreign language. So he tells all of his learned men, the astrologers, and just like Nebuchadnezzar called in all the wise men, he calls in all the wise men and says, Read to me this writing on the wall. Show me what this is and tell me what it says. Because he knows it's something important. He knows it's something he needs to know, but he has no idea what it is. So then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. So in comes the wise men, just like Nebuchadnezzar. They said to Nebuchadnezzar, We can't tell you what you've dreamed. You're going to have to tell us the dream. Here, Belshazzar is faced with writing on the wall that he cannot read, and they're basically telling him, we don't recognize the language. We're sorry. We can't read it for you. In verse 9, Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. In other words, they became frightened, because all of a sudden the king, his countenance is changed. I'm sure there's some anger. He's upset. He's scared. He doesn't know what this is. He don't know where it came from. And he's in front of 1,000 people and he needs answers. Verse 10 says, Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. In other words, don't get upset. Don't get frustrated. I have a solution. Now, this queen, was this Nebuchadnezzar's wife? Was this Nebuchadnezzar's son's wife, Belshazzar's mother, or was this actually Belshazzar's wife? We don't know. But this queen, this lady comes in, and she says to the king, Hey, settle down. Don't be upset. Don't be worried. Don't let your countenance change. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Now, Daniel's reputation was still great in the kingdom, even though Nebuchadnezzar is gone. Possibly his son's gone and now his grandson's on the throne. But he still has a reputation of being a man of the holy gods. And I like it when they say that, the holy gods. Not the man-made gods, not the gods of wrath and the gods of that mistreat human beings and all this other nonsense that you see in the Greek gods and the Roman gods and the Babylonian gods. No, these are the holy gods, is what these Babylonians referred to Daniel's God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God is a holy God, and they know these things. And so it's evident that Daniel is a Christian, and that's the point I'm trying to get to. It's evident that Daniel is a Christian, and now that there's a problem, the Christian is called to offer a solution. Folks, we have the answer to the world's problems. It's Jesus Christ. We have a home in heaven that is far better than anything on this earth. We live for something more than materialism and the things of this world. So we have something to offer. And when the world needs answers, oftentimes they turn to Christians. You let a person be diagnosed with a serious illness and they'll turn to God. You let a person have financial difficulties in their life and they'll turn to God. And a lot of times Christians are sought after at a moment of crisis in someone else's life. So Belshazzar has at a moment of crisis, and the queen comes in and says, hey, don't freak out. I know somebody that can help. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. In other words, Daniel was proven to be very smart. Whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So this guy was in charge of everybody. He's smart. He's got light in him. He's a part of the holy gods. Verse 12 says, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So she says, hey, call Daniel. His Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. This guy's name was Belshazzar. A little bit different. So let Daniel be called and let him give us the interpretation of the dream. So they call in Daniel. Verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. So now all of a sudden, Daniel's reputation precedes him. Even Belshazzar, who is either the son or grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, knew about Daniel. And his mom, the queen, has put the bug in his ear. Hey, call Daniel. Daniel can help. Verse 15, Belshazzar says to Daniel, and now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. So he tells Daniel, hey, these guys, the wise men, they can't tell me. Verse 16, and I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he's ready to elevate Daniel to a position of authority. Now, I don't know what Daniel was doing at this point. Daniel may have been in semi-retirement. I don't know. Nebuchadnezzar's gone. Maybe his son has lived and is gone, and now the grandson is here, and Daniel's getting on up in age. So, maybe Daniel was in retirement, growing cabbage or something. I don't know. But anyway, he says, I'll put you back in your position of authority. I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom. So this is a pretty high honor and a great thing that Belshazzar is offering Daniel if he can interpret this writing on the wall that just kind of appeared out of nowhere, written by a hand. So the third section says, the sovereign God humbles the proud. We're going to see Belshazzar get humbled as a result of this writing once the interpretation is given to him. So God has the ability to humble the proud. Daniel chapter 5 verse 17 says, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another, yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. Now if you remember back early on, Daniel gave up being in charge of Babylon and had that become Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's job. He said, I'll stand before the king and assist with matters of importance. So Daniel said, hey, keep your robe, keep your gold, keep your third ruler in the nation. I'll just interpret this dream for you because that's what I do. And I'm satisfied where I am. Obviously, whatever state Daniel was in, he was satisfied with that. That should kind of trigger something within us. The man was in exile in Babylon, yet he was satisfied with his position and what he had, and he was fine in his circumstance. So, verse 18 says, O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom. Now he addresses Belshazzar as king, but then he says the Most High God, the top God, the only God, as the Bible refers to, gave. Now I want you to look at that. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar didn't earn that kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar, out of his smarts, didn't grow that kingdom. God gave him the kingdom. Now think back to the statue. If you've read all of Daniel or been listening to the adult Bible study on Wednesday nights, you'd be catching up on some of these other chapters in Daniel. But this statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his first dream had a head of gold, and Daniel interpreted that as being the kingdom of Babylon, the greatest earthly kingdom to that particular point in time, and the greatest that would ever be, because all the kingdoms after Babylon were lesser than Babylon. Babylon was the ultimate, greatest kingdom. And so what Daniel is saying, and what Belshazzar knows, is that God gave Nebuchadnezzar that kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar didn't earn it. He didn't do it himself. God gave it to him. And so Daniel makes that clear in this first sentence. God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Then he goes on to say, and for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would slew, and whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. In other words, it was at the spoken word of the king, whether a person lived or died. And what happened to them. So he had a lot of power, Nebuchadnezzar did. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. In other words, when he elevated himself and said, I'm bigger and better than God, and he basically said that, I'm bigger and better than God, erected a statue to himself and expected everybody to worship him. When he elevated himself, Daniel interpreted his dream that he would be driven from men. Basically, he would become crazy for 7 years. He'd live in the pasture eating grass with the oxen. But then after that 7-year period, he'd be restored. Verse 21, and he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. So Daniel is saying, hey, look, your grandfather, or your father, Nebuchadnezzar, he knew who God was, because God put him in his place and sent him out to eat grass with the cows for 7 years. He learned that God was over all the kingdoms of the world. It's not the kings, it's God. We've got a few leaders in the world today that need to know God is still in control, and that they can trample on his children to a certain degree, but at some point he's going to execute his wrath and liberate his children. Verse 22, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knowest all of this. In other words, Daniel said, hey kid, you know what God did to your father or your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. You know what he did, yet you've not humbled yourself before him. But thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose all thy ways hast thou not glorified. In other words, dude, you brought the vessels out of God's house, you drank out of them, you desecrated them, and in the midst of that you've worshipped all these fake gods. What are you doing? That's kind of what Daniel says to him. You haven't glorified God. You haven't humbled yourself before God. That's why this message has come to you. Folks, if we lift ourselves up with pride and arrogance, we will be humbled. I promise you, at some point in time, you will be humbled. And so just know it's coming. See the handwriting on the wall. It's coming. If you are arrogant and proud and boastful, you will be put down, because God doesn't allow anyone to elevate themselves above Him. And we need to know that. Verse 24, then was the part of the hand sent from Him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. So Daniel's going to read the text that has been written on the wall. He says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now that's my, to the best of my ability, the way that it should be pronounced. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Two Menes, a Tekel, and a Upharsin. Verse 26, this is the interpretation of the thing. So we don't have to wonder what that means. Daniel goes on and tells Belshazzar what it means. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. In other words, God is over your kingdom, and God has decided that your kingdom is going to come to an end. You have not acknowledged Him. You have not done what you are supposed to do. And you have even desecrated the items that belong to Him, to God. And so your kingdom has been numbered, and it's going to end. God is done with you, and you're not going any further. And the Mene was said twice. And a lot of times in the Bible, when something is said twice, back to back, it's to draw attention to it and to reassure how important it is, that it's a definite thing. So, Mene, Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Mene, Mene. Verse 27, Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. I've heard many sermons preached off of that one verse. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. We say the statement from time to time, a person just doesn't measure up. You just don't measure up. You can't be on the team, you just don't measure up. You can't be a part of this group, you just don't measure up. You haven't achieved the level of knowledge, ability, success to be a part of this particular group. Well, folks, when we stand before God to give an account for the deeds done in this life, that's going to be a time when we want to measure up. That's going to be a time when we want to have everything in place so that we can stand before God, hear Him say, well done, and enter into heaven. Because at that particular point in time, if we don't measure up, hell is the only other option. There's not going to be a time for salvation, an opportunity for salvation, when we stand before God. The only thing at that particular point in time is going to be, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you. So here, Daniel tells Belshazzar, thou art weighed in the balance. God has judged, and you have been found wanting. You haven't measured up, Belshazzar. You haven't acknowledged God. You haven't done what you're supposed to do as a king, and now God's going to remove you. And that's the simple fact of that statement. Thou art weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Belshazzar, you haven't measured up as a king, and God's not approved of you, and He's going to remove you. And then verse 28, Perez, the Upharsin, is the next statement, and it's Perez. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. If you go back to the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, he saw the head of gold, and God told him, Nebuchadnezzar, this is you. And after you, there was silver and two arms folded. The two arms represented two kingdoms that would come together to rule in the absence of Babylon. So the Upharsin part of this, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And in Daniel's interpretation of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, the Medes and the Persians were the arms. And after Babylon was destroyed, after Belshazzar is dethroned, the Medes take over, and then later the Persians. So thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So Daniel prophesies to him what's about to take place as a result of his disobedience, as a result of his pride and arrogance. He's going to be removed as king, and his kingdom is going to be destroyed. Now, his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, just to show the difference here, Nebuchadnezzar was driven to the pasture and grazed with the cattle for 7 years, but he was restored back as king and lived out his days as king. Belshazzar, it said here, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So he's going to get a greater punishment than Nebuchadnezzar. And we'll see that play out in the next section, or the next couple of verses. Verse 29, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So Belshazzar immediately elevates Daniel to a position of authority within Babylon, places a chain about his neck, a gold chain, which I'm sure was a symbol of his authority and his position in the kingdom, and they placed a scarlet robe about his body. So he was given a position of authority, symbols of authority, a scarlet robe and a golden necklace to elevate him to the third ruler in the kingdom. But now I want you to notice that same very night, verse 30, in that night. Now this is the same night that the writing appeared on the wall, the same night that Daniel was called in, the same night that the interpretation was given. Verse 30 happens. In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Darius, a 62-year-old man, comes in, invades Babylon, and removes Belshazzar as the king and kills Belshazzar. So there was an immediate fulfillment of this particular dream. Or this particular, I said dream. I'm thinking of Nebuchadnezzar was going to tell you about him, but this handwriting on the wall, there was an immediate fulfillment. Now, back to the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a tree, as we studied in our Wednesday night lesson, and he was given 12 months before it was fulfilled. Belshazzar, it was fulfilled the same night that it was given. So both of these stories kind of give us the sense, both dealing with pride, that God, when he decides to execute his wrath or judgment on a person, it can be swift, it can be delayed, or it can be immediate, but it can be delivered quickly by God, and that's what we need to understand. We need to serve God to the best of our ability, not elevate ourselves with pride and arrogance, humbly serve the Lord. The Bible says that they that humble themselves shall be exalted, and they that exalt themselves shall be abased. So if we'll humble ourselves, come to God, seek for his forgiveness, do the best that we can, maintain a humble relationship with God, we'll be able to, and God will be pleased with us. But if we exalt ourselves, we will be abased. And I think a lot of the world leaders, Putin and Xi and Merkel in Germany, and even the Queen in England, we don't see a collective acknowledging God's authority over the world. These leaders come together and make decisions with their governments, and even when the United Nations comes together and makes collective decisions, there's no real acknowledging God going on in the world today. That's not good. God is not going to always put up with that. So, I can't affect these leaders. I can't affect their decision-making process. But I can affect mine. And as a pastor and as a father, as a physical therapist, I can be filled with pride. And I can present myself as being all-knowing, all-powerful. I can abuse my position and the authority that has been placed within me. I can become arrogant and cocky. And I can become a menace to the church and our church family. But I hope that I stay humble, and that I will thank God for His blessings, and thank God for the position that He has given me, and do my best to serve the church in a way that is pleasing to God, and not become a lord over the church, and use my position and become prideful and arrogant and think I know it all. I hope I never become that kind of pastor and that kind of person, because God is not pleased with people that exalt themselves. So I hope that through this lesson you've seen the handwriting on the wall. You know to avoid pride and arrogance, and you know that God is all powerful. And if we elevate ourselves and begin to serve other gods and don't do the things that God would have us to do, He can bring us down, and He can get our attention. We may see a handwriting on the wall or some event similar that lets us know, hey, God's still in control, and I need to be serving Him and doing the best that I can. Hope you enjoyed the lesson today. Invite you back for our Sunday morning service at 10. Hope you have the opportunity to join us, and we look forward to seeing you. Hope you have a great week.